This game features the most insane Super GM time scramble I've ever personally seen live. So it's Magnus Carlsen against Alireza Firouzja. It's the Banter Blitz Cup Final from 2020. I'm covering the whole series. You can check out the playlist. In this game, Alireza has white and the match is now levelled at 5.5 each. It's the first to 8.5, so it's getting really tense now. So Alireza kicks off here with pawn to e4. Both players only have 3 minutes on the clock. Pawn to e5. We have knight f3, knight c6, and after bishop b5, Magnus goes for a Berlin. He says, okay, let's play what I played in Vaikanze and won with a few months ago. He's referencing January 2020 where he beat Alireza in this system. So we now had pawn d3, pawn d6. They go down the line they played. Pawn c3, bishop e7, both players castled, knight b to d2, rook e8, the rook came to e1 here, a6 kicked the bishop, it came back, and now bishop f8, this one gets tucked away, opens up the rook, all very nice. Knight f1, remanoeuvres that knight, pawn b5 from Magnus, and now here's the first surprise of the game. So in Vaikanze, Firouzja played bishop to c2, but here he goes bishop b3. Now in this bishop c2 line, Magnus set up with pawn to g6 and bishop on b7, but it's so instructive how Super GMs just switch plans depending on what their opponents do. So after bishop to b3, you've got threats down here, the knight could come to g5, it's a different game. So pawn h6 played, a different pawn structure, Magnus reacts. Now we had knight g3, and now instead of the bishop going on b7, Magnus goes bishop e6, he challenges this strong piece, really nice adaptation of his play. So the bishop now came to c2, and this was probably a bit slow really. Alireza should take here. After rook recaptures, say he goes d4, Magnus was calculating d5 and his judgment was spot on, black is equalising here. It's complicated of course, lots of tension, but black is okay. But instead of taking on e6, we had bishop c2, and now Magnus gets d5 but in a more favourable position, because after captures, the bishop takes back so as to protect this pawn twice now from the attack, and black has fully equalised, is doing well. So we had queen e2 from Alireza, pawn to g6 from Magnus, he prepares to fianchetto the bishop, pawn h3, and this is what Alireza does so well now. He's a bit worse, yes, but he just plays little improving, waiting moves, makes it difficult for Magnus. So we had bishop g7, the bishop came out to e3, looking at this weakened square. Knight d7 covers the square, but more importantly prepares to play pawn to f5. We had bishop to b3 from Alireza now, not the best move, but it's tough to play a move for white here. He exchanges these ones off, opens up the a file, hoping to get a bit of play there, but Magnus now gets pawn f5 and he's got the centre, he's got the pawn breaks available to him. Now there's a threat to go pawn to f4 here, so Alireza drops back. And now best for Magnus was to go pawn to f4 immediately, because now the bishop can't come to c5, the knight is covering, it would have to drop back, let's say to c1, knight c5 could come, pressuring the pawn. It's just a very pleasant position for black of course, but what Magnus did was go knight to f6, a preparatory move, but now after pawn b4 from Alireza, you can't go pawn to f4, well you can, but now the bishop comes to c5, it finds a really nice home there, big improvement on the previous position. So instead of going pawn to f4 here, Magnus goes queen d7, again he just wants to improve his pieces before striking in the centre. We had queen c2 from Alireza, so he's just waiting, he's looking at this diagonal maybe in future, so Magnus tucks the king away, and now the bishop came into c5 here, and Magnus centralised his knight onto the d5 square. A really nice move, looking at f4 later on. And probably best here was pawn g3, or the bishop dropping back to e3, just covering this square, but instead we had knight to g3 from Alireza. He's trying to entice f4 to open up the e4 square, but actually knight to f4 was good here for Magnus. Not that you're breaking through, the rook could come across to defend, this rook could come across for black, it's just a pleasant advantage. Magnus plays slightly differently. He goes queen to f7. You can tell he's such an experienced player. You know, he's constantly thinking about his opponent's plans, his king safety on the light squares. He doesn't want to rush his position. We now had rook to a3 from Alireza, so he's preparing to double. He wants to pressure this backwards pawn, and that's why Magnus takes the chance to liberate while he can. He goes pawn a5. We had an exchange here, the rook recaptured, and we have a pair coming off the board. And now it's still really hard for Alireza. How do you get these knights into the game? They're being really dominated by these pawns, taking all this space. It's hard to break d4. So Alireza waits again. He goes knight to f1. This knight came back to b7. It hits the bishop, and after it retreats, we had this exchange on e3, and Magnus brings the knight into this beautiful d6 square where it looks at all these central points here. And now rook to a1 was played by Alireza, and again Magnus praised Alireza's play at this point in the game, saying he moves his pieces so well around the board, keeps you guessing, doesn't make it easy. And before I go on with the game here, if you're enjoying the video, do consider subscribing if you haven't already to never miss another in the series. So after rook to a1, Magnus goes rook d8. Okay, he doesn't want to break too soon. He could have gone pawn e4, I should say, but after captures, let's say knight captures, it's not actually too much for black. White now has the d4 square as well, so he just slow plays it, rook d8. Now this knight dropped to d2, the rook came to d7, this knight came into b3, looking at c5, but you just have to be a bit careful because if you leave your king too much, you could be getting attacked. And this is what Magnus thinks now. Pawn f4, I have to strike, I know how fast Alireza is, I don't want to get stung in time pressure again. So the knight drops back here, now he goes f3, looks really scary, but after pawn g3, you just close some lines. The queen comes to f5, hitting the pawn here, but king h2 defends just for the moment. And now you can go e4 again, trying to break through, open up the bishop, say white captures, knight captures. This knight could come to e3, queen e6. As you can see, you're not actually breaking through for the moment here. It's still a nice position for black, decent edge, but you're not actually breaking through. So Magnus holds off on e4. Instead, he goes knight f7. He's looking to come to g5, pressure this pawn. And so here Alireza reacts with knight e3 once again. And his judgment is superb because he's giving this pawn on d3. Magnus recaptures, but he does note that Alireza has these beautiful knights here, which are really better minor pieces than Magnus's, especially this bishop, which is staring at its own pawn at the moment. So the rook came to a7 now, activating to the 7th rank. Magnus already could have considered knight d6 here, just giving the pawn, keeping his own rook activated, but instead he drops back, and after knight c5, he bounces back with the rook. Looks like he's lost a bunch of time, but after the knight came to c5, it left the protection of the d2 square. So the rook powerfully activated down here. It looks at both of these pawns, and that's why Alireza went knight e4 first, not only attacking the rook, but holding this f2 pawn. And look at the beautiful outpost for this knight, just blocks in this pawn as well, which then blocks in the bishop. So Magnus picks up here, Alireza takes on c7, and now Magnus is really thinking. Both players have about 30 seconds on the clock, they're roughly level at this stage, but Magnus burns a lot of time here trying to calculate knight g5. He could go king g8, but knight g5 is the best move. Excellent play from Magnus, and this is what he has to calculate. So Alireza has knight f6 check, using this pin against the bishop. The king drops back here, he checks from here, and the only way to block the check is with the bishop, so you're just losing a piece, right? Well, this is what Magnus was working out. If you take that bishop immediately, then king g7 is actually good. You hit both of these pieces, black is better. So Alireza didn't take that bishop, instead he played this knight across. He now defends this one, so he is threatening to take the bishop. So Magnus goes pawn h5. They're on such little time, but finding the best moves in the position here. It's just awesome chess. And Alireza responds again with the first choice move, pawn h4. He kicks Magnus's knight. So Magnus took here, and now Alireza makes a mistake. He should take here, recapturing that knight. But what he does instead is take the pawn on g4. And the issue with this is that now Magnus can retreat the knight and defend the bishop at the same time. Now white can take here, go a pawn up, attack this one, but without going through the details, black is better a piece up here. Even with the time pressure, this would be hard to hold. But okay, Magnus missed to do this. After Alireza captured here, he went king to g7. He's got about 11 seconds now, Alireza 18. So we had h takes on g5, the bishop came to e7, rook c7, king f7, the knight picked up on e5 with check, and the king came to e6. So it's a level position here. Although white is a pawn up, the black pieces are active. Look at these threats here. Now the knight moved away, the bishop took on g5, now the pawns are level again. We had rook c6 check, king f5, the king came to h3, it defends the knight here, and now this bishop came to d2, and at this point it's just all about the clock. Alireza starts checking. So he goes rook c5 check, king e4, rook e5 check. He's just driving the king in. These aren't the best moves, but it's all about the time scramble. King d3, and now pawn c4. He's just chucking pawns, keeping it complicated. Magnus takes. He's got 6 seconds versus Alireza's 11, and Alireza's a beast, of course. Rook d5 check, king e2, rook e5 check, king f1. So this king's marched all the way in. Black is completely winning here, but can he hold on the clock? So knight h2 check played. It gives this pawn. Knight g4 check, king f1, rook d5 now, hits the bishop, it comes to f4. Of course that can be taken, but neither player's even focused on the actual moves at this stage really. Knight h2 check comes, Magnus chops that one off, the king recaptures, and he's moaning at this point. I'm so fucking slow, he says. Excuse my language. He's getting really annoyed. So king takes on h2, pawn f2 played. Now the bishop gets taken on g4 finally, f4 rather. The king comes into e2 here, and Alireza's pre-moving, so rook e5 check. The king moves away. Now he goes f5, and after f1 queen, he'd already pre-moved this one. He walks into mate. Magnus has 0.2 seconds on the clock. He wins the game and smashes the desk, cheering around it. He can't believe it. He goes 1-up in the match, and he thinks this might be the game that secures him the match. So an epic game from both players. If you want to see the whole playlist, click here, and see tomorrow's game, do tune in.